Hello, and welcome back to Between Two Psychs. Today, we're talking about exclusions and what causes them. This question comes in from Charlie Lennon, who raised it in a LinkedIn post to me. Welcome, Mike. How are you this week?
Hi, Adam. Thanks. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I feel like this is going to be an interesting one today because exclusions is one of those things. Everybody's got an opinion on it, but there's plenty of data out there. But unpicking that data isn't the easiest thing to do, is it?
You're absolutely right. And also, working as a team around children that are either excluded or up for exclusion can be a challenging business as well.
Yeah. And what defines an exclusion? There's confusion factors around managed moves and difference between PECs and suspensions and expulsions. And the terminology changes all the time, doesn't it? But I thought it might be a good place to start with giving a little trend of what is out there, what is known. So from 2008 to 2014, exclusions steadily declined. Okay. Then from 2014 to 2019, they steadily rose. And then once the pandemic hit, there was a sharp increase. And that sharp increase was felt across the board, but the brunt of it was held by secondary schools. Within that data, there's some interesting findings too. If you are a secondary school student, you're 10 times more likely to be excluded than a primary school student. If you receive free school meals, you're more likely to be excluded 5 times than your peers. If you have SEND, as special educational needs and disabilities, you're more likely to be excluded. And that includes those within the HCP. And boys are twice as likely to be excluded as girls. Most exclusions happen in year 9 and 10. I thought that is an absolute wealth of stuff to unpack there. And I don't know if we'll completely figure it out today, but hopefully we can give the listeners something useful and maybe some practical strategies on how to get in early and avoid exclusions rather than the demographics of it all.
Okay. Yep. So interesting data there. And one of the things that we spoke about earlier on was the difference between primary and secondary. I think you said, what was it, 10 times?
You're 10 times more likely to be excluded in secondary school. Now that's as of 2024. So imagine that the numbers are slightly skewed because of the pandemic. I wonder in primary schools that because you have one teacher and there's less pressures around performance metrics such as GCSEs, that you're less likely to be excluded. Those settings, those primary school settings, are going to find it easier to focus. Well, easier is not the right word, is it? They're going to have more time and dedicated resources to focusing on how to support that child in the class because they have that dedicated relationship with one adult, as opposed to secondary schools. You have maybe 5, 6 teachers across the day, and you're more interested in your peer-to-peer relationships than adult relationships.
It's definitely in there, Adam, isn't it? And also looking at identity and confidence in identity. We have different challenges for children that are in key stage 3 and 4 as they mature into young adults with all that's going around them. And potentially they are using different outlets to address the challenges to their identity than younger children.
That's an interesting point. I feel like identity is something we need to unpick a bit more, particularly around that key stage 3 element. I've seen a stat somewhere that there's a huge drop in happiness at year 7. So, and then that stays low until about year 10, 11. And I wondered if that had something to do with the identity matrix coming into play. Because you're shifting away from that pre-adolescence way of life into more peer-to-peer socializing. And that's a hugely confusing time for kids, not to mention puberty. What do you think on that?
There's a lot of research around the complexities of identity, and Erickson was one of the people that jumps to mind with me. Um, you move out of the like you described the system of a primary school, which is typically one classroom, one teacher. Although I know there are some differences, but typically it is into an environment that's much larger, much noisier, and more fluid in terms of the people that you meet, as well as the members of staff that you meet. So it's no surprise, is it, that happiness is going to dip? I mean, I'd be curious as to why it raises at the end of year of 10 or 11, but it's no surprise that it dips.
I'm not entirely confident in why it raises again. I had some notion about consolidation of identity where you start to figure out what your interests are, what you might do in your
Yeah.
adulthood years, what university's not that far away. So you start to think about what
Mm,
courses you're going to do, and that identity becomes a bit more solidified, and you have a stronger sense of who you're friends with and what a good friend means to you. Generally, not for every person, obviously, and not to mention the rise in mental health needs amongst our teenagers, and
yeah.
the use of social media can be an issue as well.
Yep.
Lots of teenagers are finding social isolation because of social media. They feel like they're connected online, but it's not true connection, which we know has to be done face to face. Yeah, so the identity question is something definitely worth unpacking a bit there.
Yeah. And looking also at the main category that supports the inclusion exclusion data, which is the behavior, that the persistent disruptive behavior, and why people who are in the key stage 3/4 cohort are demonstrating those behaviors that are leading to fixed term and permanent exclusions. If we consider the wider picture of identity and the challenges that go on, why is it that some young people are having to use that persistent behavior rather than others? What's your casework telling you, Adam?
My casework is saying that it usually comes, well, I could be wrong on this, but I don't think I am. It comes down to some form of acceptance. Most children feel okay and are likely to comply when they feel accepted. And what leads to acceptance is a sense of competency, a sense of social congruence, a sense of peer-to-peer acceptance and adult to child acceptance. And for many students, especially stepping into that secondary school environment where you're having 5 or 6 transitions a day, and we know from the primary school data, transitions can be really tricky for some students, that they do this predictability factor over and over again, whereby, "Okay, I'm gonna go and see my next teacher. Are they gonna be in a good mood? Oh, it's history. History isn't something I feel confident in. How do I get around this feeling of, incompetency? I'm gonna act up." It just makes me feel like, okay, I can just, as long as I last 30 minutes or an hour of just avoiding the thing that I can't do, then I'll be okay. And I can keep that social identity or that social competency amongst my peers. Like, I don't care about history. Therefore, I don't need to participate. And we know from Wenger's communities of practice, participation is one of the key elements to developing a sense of identity within a learning community. And if you don't feel that you can participate, that is going to affect your well-being. And I think that's what's happening for a lot of students. And
Mm,
when we look at this in terms of context of what schools are going through, we've had funding cut in the days of austerity in real term. I know that the actual number goes up. but how far that number goes is reduced. And that means that the staff on the ground are increasingly stretched.
Yeah, there's another one, Adam. Is resources. But coming back to your descriptions from casework, my own experiences of casework would suggest that there's a lot of layers to us as people. You know, we talk about the analogy of an onion with its layers, and how the interplay between the different layers can lead to personal challenges for us, depending on the trigger. For some, that trigger might be social context. For some, the trigger might be more close relationships, you know, such as developing good friends. And for some, that trigger might be academics. You know, there's quite a few triggers to our own layers of the onion.
Hmm.
And the casework that I've been involved with has often involved having to dig down and find which layer of the onion is triggering the response that's being observed in the child. And that's where we start getting into the assessments that EdScience can do, but also the evidence-based interventions that come. And evidence-based is two things here. Evidence-based being this intervention has proved to work, but the other evidence is this is why I'm recommending this particular intervention, is because the assessment has given us evidence that this layer is the trigger.
So you're doing both a top down and a bottom up approach. The top down being the theoretical or research based approach, and the bottom up being this is what the context looks like for this child, and that's why I'm adapting the research and the theory for this particular situation. Um, in your experience of doing casework, have you noticed any trends about the same things that come up in the casework where exclusion is at risk?
Yeah, it's often connected, I find, to SEMH, so social, emotional, mental health. That would be the biggest category of SEND I come across that would sort of create a pattern. How about yourself?
It's similar. I get a lot of cases with autism diagnosis as well.
Yeah.
And the common thread, like obviously each case has its own merits and particularities. But what I have noticed is when it comes to things with social communication, like autism, like ADHD, there's an element of I don't understand the social rules in this environment. I don't understand why I have to behave in this particular way in this particular context when that holds no value to me. So if I'm not interested, going back to history, if I'm not interested in history, why do I have to sit quiet for it when I'd rather be doing something else? So the social rules of secondary school tend to be a little bit confusing for some students. In addition to that, with autism, just thinking about particular cases I've done, some of the ones I've come across is I want to have friends, but I have no idea how to navigate that. I also misinterpret lots of social interactions because some of them I feel like they are bullying me. Whereas we know in the teenage years, there's the whole banter culture and what is friendly teasing versus what is active bullying can be very confusing for teenagers. And I come across a lot of cases like that. I also come across cases for girls in particular of eating disorders. The sense of I'm in my teenage years, things feel difficult to control. So, what is the one thing that I can control? I can control my diet. Or then that quite often leads to non attendance, doesn't it? So, we're seeing all these different factors come out, and they all seem to be linked to the change in social environment for a lot of these children.
Yep. Um, and the other thing that comes through from casework is the difficulty being able to trust. And that I've noticed has come across through various age groups, not just secondary. And, in one respect, the young people are, communicating their challenges through their behavior, and they're wanting relationships with adults, but at the same time, they can't have the relationship with the adult because they've got inbuilt challenges around trusting people. So, and the aspects of trust can come from, we know children who've experienced trauma, but they can come from children that have had backgrounds that don't involve trauma.
Mhm.
It's not always pigeonholed to children that have had traumatic histories. Again, it's looking at the layers and trying to work out what's triggering the particular responses in the environment. And trust is a difficult one to spot, but it's also a very profound one because it will have an impact on the therapeutic relationship that staff are trying to have. The staff are doing the right thing. There's no doubt about it. They are absolutely doing the right thing, but it's not being absorbed by the young person because they can't actually allow themselves to engage at a level with the adult the intervention requires.
And what do you think is those blockers for trust? If the adult is trying to do the right thing, what is it in children's development that stops them engaging with that?
Mhm. It's I just find that's when you start as an ed psych, identifying that trust could be a plausible hypothesis. It is a very bespoke approach to investigating and trying to arrive at a valid conclusion. It's doable, we do it all the time, but I haven't got a one size fits all
No,
answer to that one.
and it leads back to what you were saying before around the assessment informs the approach rather than just cherry picking a piece of research or an intervention off the wall. And I'm wondering, when it comes to things like trust, do you find that you have to explore the interpersonal relationships, not just between the child and certain key adults, but also between how communication happens around those adults?
Absolutely, Adam, and I often find the exploration goes beyond the school walls and out into the community, and I consider things like the Bronfenbrenner model, where we have to start looking at the micro and macro environments. So, for people that aren't aware of that, I'm talking about looking at the immediate environment, such as the classroom or the school, and then beyond the school walls into the wider community, and that could be family or extended family, or even into very
Unit
close
groups.
knit community. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And the thing you talk about, certain community aspects plays a key role because we know that certain communities are more likely to experience exclusions or permanent exclusions. And that shows that the strongest data is around socioeconomic factors. So those who are closer to levels of poverty are more likely to be excluded. And what that raises for me is that sometimes within a child's life, although they spend a lot of time at school, it might not be the most important thing in their life. There might be a bigger factor at play that gives them a sense of safety and self worth. And I wonder if it's hard for schools to pick up on that and to explore that.
yeah. I,
And what
I
can schools
think
do about it? Go on, sorry.
No, you're absolutely right, Adam, and you question what can schools do about it, and it does come back. I mean, self-worth is tied into what we said originally about identity, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And as ed psychs, we have a hard time unpicking all these different factors of play, and teachers have the added pressure of delivering the curriculum on top of that. So I want to spend the next few minutes exploring what can realistically be done to avoid exclusions across the board, but probably given the fact that most of it is in secondary schools and most of the data is around that year 9 and year 10 level. Is there something around key stage 3 that needs to be looked at? And what I'm getting at, Mike, is that I've noticed that some schools have taken quite a would from a traditional point of view, is a radical approach where for year 7, a lot of students are put into classes with a dedicated teacher, just one teacher who delivers all their lessons, like they would in primary school. And I just wondered what your views were around the whether that's a theoretically an effective approach or not.
From a psychologist's point of view, we would have to start looking at what benefit does that have to young people that are exposed to that approach? And so we go back to consistency, and we go back to meaningful relationships to the young person. And I mean meaningful in the sense of I feel I can build a relationship with this person because I see them so much. And then we start looking at what impact is that potentially going to have upon a young person's emotions when they're in the school. We considered in the previous podcast about children with autism and getting them ready to learn by looking at consistency and predictability. So I'm also wondering here in this example you gave whether having that consistency and predictability is also enabling a young child to feel like, right, okay, I'm not having too many layers of my onion triggered here, so because of that, I can start to relax. Maybe because of that, I can start to trust the adult that's a consistent figure in my life. Whether I like them or not doesn't really matter, but trust is there because they're a figure of authority in the school.
I could predict their behavior.
Mm. Yeah.
And that also brings us around to like the use of specialist resource spaces or even alternative provision. We've seen a huge increase in alternative provision since I've started my career. And resource bases, they were around quite a bit when I started out, but they're still relevant. And we see them a lot for children, like you said, with SEMH needs or
Mm.
autism, whereby they would spend the majority of their day in a single location with a dedicated adult. And all this comes back to relationships, trust, you've said. And when we look at the what works for with children in terms of behavior and managing environments, nearly always there is a key relationship or a series of key relationships that are at play. And for those students at high risk of exclusion, that sense of community or relationships or trusted relationships, as you highlighted, has to be limited. There must be something about the psychodevelopmental journey of children who are at risk of exclusion, who struggle to trust, who struggle to understand relationships, who struggle to develop relationships, who struggle to understand when someone is trying to develop a relationship with them. And it just got me thinking that we spend a lot of time, in particularly in primary schools, focusing on developing relationships. How do we do that for those vulnerable students in secondary school?
Well, one of the approaches, as you've described, is an answer to that. I mean, there are some settings that, for whatever reason, can't offer that type of intervention, and so we have to then start considering, work from an ed site point of view with the members of the pastoral staff, because they're going to be able to spend the downtime with young people. And by downtime, I mean non-lesson time. But we'd also be looking at working with school leaders to identify, almost do an audit of the staff approaches and the staff skill set. And through that audit, being able to identify, well, what do we need as a community in order to enhance experiences of belonging and the sense of identity that we want to encourage in young people. And from there on, you then start looking at a training program using the likes of ourselves or other specialists in local authorities that could come on board and support with the approach that the school leaders want to take.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think training is something that needs to be looked at because not every school could set up these dedicated resource bases
No.
or invest in alternative provision whereby the child leaves the school for a bit and then they focus on the reintegration aspect of it. And that's not always successful anyway. And
Mm.
focus on the universal day-to-day side of relationships. And me, I'll take any chance I get to talk about the training I've developed around therapeutic teaching, of one
Mm.
aspect of which is identity forming.
Mm.
And we look at how you shape communal identity, peer to peer identity. And one thing that I query about is the use of inquiry based learning, as opposed to well, the old fashioned way of regurgitation of facts and figures and sit down and write out an essay type thing. What I'm getting at is if you take a communities of practice approach and you look at inquiry based learning, whereby students are compelled to work with one another around the topic, what would that do for identity, sense of purpose? Now, thinking about those SEMH type children you mentioned, and it's maybe the more high functioning autism end.
Mm.
Whereas if you had a pure cognitive or learning need, that might be a bit more tricky. But do you think there's some merit in that? Something that hasn't really been rolled out?
It could be, Adam, and I haven't got, hands-on experience of being in the classroom often enough anymore to be able to say whether I'm seeing that style of learning or not. But as I listen to it, I would be thinking, if I was a teacher, that's certainly an approach that I would like to be taking. Um, because it says to me about engagement and inquiry-based learning is it's a conversation. So
Yeah.
if there's a conversation going on, it means that somebody has to say something and somebody has to listen, and then somebody responds and somebody listens, etc. And that goes back into what we're talking about, relationships and identity and self-worth and a sense of trust and a sense of belonging, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing I want to talk about is policy formation, because you mentioned senior leaders. And when I was working in Dorset, we had a big drive to move secondary schools in particular away from behavior policies onto a more relational policy approach. And I'm just wondering, in your experience as an ethic, have you come across anything that's really worked around that aspect of, is there any type of policy that really hits home?
I think if I said yes to that, the DFE would be on it and saying, "Come on, tell us more," because I think that's the magic answer in a medicine bottle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
And I'd be doing this on my own then. You'd be off gallivanting with the DFE.
uh, but relational, I mean, that says so much, doesn't it? The relational approach, regardless of what angle you take under the umbrella term of the relational approach, it says so much about relationships. And for all of us as adults working in schools, whether we're staff or visitors, how do we foster relationships? What value do we personally place on relationships and why? How are we fostering those relationships? How are we empowering young people to have a relationship with us and with each other? So
Yeah.
I really think you're onto something saying that, Adam.
Yeah, because it was really privileged work. And, I know you've spoken to me a lot about leadership, and I've talked to you about the journeys I've gone on with head teachers. And it always comes down to clarity of process, clarity of message, so everybody's on the same page. And a well written policy really helps that. And what I found in that time with Dorset was there was a lot of confusion around the processes behind, well, what was then behavior policies. When do you graduate up to, you got to see the head of year, or you've got to, if it's not head of year, it's Senko. When does it get to be more serious where the head teacher has to be called in? When do you bring the parents and all those types of things? What was the threshold if the child did X behavior? Was this like a red, or was this an amber type behavior? Different schools had different approaches to their behavior policy. But one common theme that always came through was I never seen enough of the Senko's role in that. It was always either pastoral first, then graduate into more authoritarian roles whereby the head teacher who would have to then do some sort of punitive type thing. And you might see something about restorative conversations or restorative practice, but I couldn't find any practical examples on how to carry out that conversation. Again, we're going back to training. um, how to carry out a restorative conversation is not the easiest thing in the world. It is not a case of sitting down with the student and saying, "You've done this wrong. Do you feel bad about it?" Yada yada yada. It's about rebuilding that relationship. Going back to what you said at the beginning around trust. How do you show empathy to that child through curiosity, sometimes playfulness and acceptance, even when it's something quite serious? You're trying to rebuild that element of trust, but also can keep the boundaries. And then the sympathetic side of me is like that teacher also has to deliver the curriculum. So where do they find the time for that? How do you resource that time? And we know we're in a stage of funding that things are really difficult at the moment for teachers to even free up time to deliver the curriculum. Never mind this pastoral role that they're doing. But things like that are really important, and that they are felt across the school. And I'd say, for secondary schools, if they're struggling to do that across the school, that data we find where there's a real dip in year 7 and it starts to tick up by year 10, maybe there's something around key stage 3 provision has to look different from key stage 4.
Well, maybe, Adam, maybe. I mean, I think the thrust of our conversation so far is definitely hinged on, identity, and, more recently in the conversation around relationships. We shouldn't ignore the design and delivery of the curriculum. It would be nice as Ed Sykes if we got invited more into that conversation. But I want to answer a question that you asked, which is, how do we develop these relationships? And there's a couple of things that Ed Sykes are promoting at the moment. There's the big drive around ELSA, so emotional literary support assistance,
Mm.
to assist young people to understand the emotional side of themselves, and that would foster some stability and maybe some courage in relationship building. We've also got emotion coaching as a big drive across the country. Again, very, very evidence-based, very successful in terms of helping adults in schools to foster relationships with young people. And then last but not least is an approach called motivational interviewing. It's been around for a long time, but that's really gathering pace in the EdSite community working with schools. And, one of the cornerstones of motivation interviewing is the OARS, OARS, where, if people are interested, it's a very, very constructive, free-flowing method of engaging with other people. O standing for having open questions, A standing for affirmations, the R standing for reflective listening, and then the S is summarizing. And there's various ways of looking at OARS, but it's a very, very successful and very powerful method of helping young people to engage. As soon as you and I talk and the other one affirms what someone said, it has quite a strong impact. And that's on two of us that are getting on and have.
Well, I'm young enough to be your grandson.
Yeah, yeah. In your dreams.
I love that framework, though.
Yeah.
Can you remind me? Was it open questions, reflective questioning, and
Affirmations, so OARS, so open questions, and then the A is for affirming. So it's, essentially affirming what maybe someone said or the effort that someone has gone through. And then R is reflective listening, and the S is summarizing or summaries.
Can we just stick with that for a moment? That framework. One, that's something somebody could learn in a day, or even in an afternoon. And two, what would that do for the trust element if that's successfully implemented?
It's almost got to be tried and experienced for someone to be able to say, "Wow, that really had an impact on me." And I did the motivation interviewing training And the A side has an incredible power when you affirm somebody. It's such a strong human need, and it's something that we can easily overlook, but equally easily use.
Yeah.
Affirming someone for what they've tried, affirming someone for what they've said, etc., etc. Even in the middle of when this child is really displaying challenging behavior, finding something that you can affirm is powerful.
It comes back to, you'll see a lot on pop psychology stuff about being seen. But even my own research when I was studying for the doctorate, it was seeing the same things amongst professionals that in order to collaborate or someone and change their mind, there was a process by which professionals would validate a perspective and then challenge it. So I can see where you're coming from. Have you considered X, Y, or Z? And you're saying the same thing almost. It's like I can see why that's happened, or I can see your point of view. I can see why you've resulted in that behavior. And then the gentle nudge or the firm challenge comes in at that point. Is that what you're getting at with motivational interviewing?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule. The beauty with motivation interviewing is that the character of the adult is merged with the framework. So you don't have to learn ways of saying things. As long as you've got the framework in your head, you can proceed. But the emotion coaching side, which we know about, would teach somebody not to challenge someone when they're at the peak of the explosion, because they're not going to be able to engage with your questioning. And when they're on the coming down bit, not to say, why did you do that? I have no idea why I did that. I absolutely have no idea. Whereas if
It's regulated.
you know, whereas if you said something like, looking back on it, how would you like to have responded? You'll get a different response.
Where do you think "I wonder" questions, do they sit in that framework okay? I wonder if you responded that way because
I think being curious is excellent. So, yeah, yeah. All of that I find is brilliant. All those styles of interaction are opening an individual up to engage and just think you're not judging me. And, if you're not judging me, I've got a chance of maybe just liking you a little bit.
or at least trusting you if I don't like you.
But,
I want
no,
Go on.
go on, Adam. Sorry.
I want to highlight this book as well. This is something I find, particularly useful for those who are on the spectrum or, the primary school age children. And if you're resource light, you can't access ELSA and things like that. I recommend this book. It's called The Homunculi Approach. And it's written by Greg and McKay. So, if for the people who have the benefit of video, I've held it up with the camera. And what that book does is, for those who have seen Inside Out, children are encouraged to create avatars, and there's certain avatars that are non-negotiable. So I think the book says you have to have a manager character in it. And what the child's encouraged to do is create a narrative around what happens inside their own body or their own head when they're presented with the situation. So a child I did it with created a character called Zippy. And when something happened, Zippy would suddenly wake up and then have to go and then mess up the day for all the other characters. And then it was the other character's responsibility to put Zippy back in line. And it gave a framework, an internal working model essentially for that child to problem solve in the moment for themselves. So if they go, oh, Zippy's woken up, I've got to do certain things to get him back on board. And it's just a really creative visual way of implementing basic CBT. For a lot of students who struggle with the relationship side of things, I think that's a good resource to use.
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. And the things we're talking about, I know we're kind of nudging towards the end of this podcast, but the things we're talking about are things that schools can try. There are things that people, whether they're working in a school or a youth group or whatever else, they can try. And then, I know we both agree with this, even though I'm saying it. There are some children that do just require a little bit more than what's on offer in the mainstream school, and that's why we do have the alternative provisions to give a little bit of a boost, and so forth. But the majority of situations that we've both come across with our casework are, I think, going to be predominantly around understanding the layers of the onion, as the ed psych, and being able to support schools to understand, the onion, and why that particular layer is causing a response. We're also talking about identity and relating to that particular identity, as in relationships. And talking about approaches that we've come across, evidence-based approaches like the ELSA, the emotion coaching and the motivation interview. But it's a difficult world, Adam, isn't it? We can't ignore that. Yeah.
Like you said, we're both staunch believers in inclusion, and if we had
Yeah.
a magic wand, we'd have every child in a mainstream setting. But we are also realistic, and we live in the real world, and we understand the need for balance, the balance
Yeah.
between what's right for children and what's right for staff, what's right for schools, what's right for families. And the sad reality is we don't have enough resources to get that perfect system at the moment. So we've got a work around using psychology to get the optimal positioning for schools at the moment. And that takes a lot of work and dedication on everybody's part.
It does, Adam, and hats off to ed psychs out there looking for creative ways. I know there's a national shortage of us, and there's a huge demand on us, but hats off to everybody who's trying so hard to support the schools, and hats off to schools and families for, supporting the young people as they go through their developmental journey.
Yeah. So that kind of wraps up this episode. We didn't even get to touch on some things like trauma, but I feel like that would be an entire episode in itself because for the layer that, going back to your onion analogy, the layers they unpick with that is just, it would take us at least an hour to unpack that. But I
It'll
feel
take
like,
you an hour just to get past the preamble, Adam.
hey, there's a lot to disseminate. And people, he is this cheeky just talking. He's not holding back on the podcast.
It was nice talking to you today, though, Adam.
Yes, and we'll have just for our listeners, we are still curious about questions. We would like to hear what you want talked about and what you want answered. So please leave a comment below, wherever you get this podcast, whether it's Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts. It's up in a couple other places too. You can also contact each of us on LinkedIn. Give us a question. Just type in our names, and you can contact us on our websites. Mine is www.dradammccartney.com, and Mike, yours is?
It's ridgewaypsychology.co.uk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, see you soon. Thanks, everybody.